Have you ever had the strange feeling that you are no longer simply living your life, but constantly watching yourself live it through the imagined eyes of others? It is not always dramatic. Most of the time it happens quietly. You think carefully before speaking, not only to be understood, but to avoid disapproval. You adjust your emotions so they appear reasonable, acceptable, appropriate. You weigh your choices not only by what feels true to you, but by how they might be received. On the outside, everything may seem normal. You continue working, speaking, functioning, moving through your days. But inwardly, something has shifted. A part of you no longer moves freely. It pauses first. It waits. It looks outward for permission before it allows itself to fully exist. Carl Jung believed there comes a significant moment in psychological life when a person grows tired of this condition. Not tired because they have failed, and not tired because the world has rejected them, but tired of constantly measuring themselves against the reactions of others. Tired of living as though the final authority over their worth exists outside of them. Tired of needing the world to confirm what should have been rooted much deeper. And Jung did not see this weariness as a mistake. He saw it as a signal, a turning point, a quiet but profound indication that the psyche is ready for a different movement. Not outward, but inward. Not toward greater performance, but toward greater honesty. Not toward becoming more acceptable, but toward becoming more real. This is where many people become confused. They assume that if they no longer want to keep orienting themselves around approval, something must be wrong. They think they are losing motivation, losing direction, becoming detached, selfish, or withdrawn. But Jung would suggest something very different. He would say that this discomfort may be the beginning of a return to the inner center that has been neglected for too long. This is not a call to reject the world. It is not an invitation to cut yourself off from people, responsibilities, or relationships. It is something subtler than that. It is the beginning of a deep inner journey, one in which you slowly stop using the outer gaze as the primary measure of your life. You begin to ask different questions, not, will this be admired? Not, will this make sense to everyone else? Not, will I be approved of if I choose this? But something far more difficult and far more alive. Is this true for me? Does this belong to my path? What in me is trying to live, even if no one else understands it yet? Perhaps you are beginning to feel the exhaustion of living too long on the surface of yourself. Perhaps you are sensing that what you have been seeking in the eyes of others can never fully satisfy what is missing. Perhaps the life you are meant to live does not begin when the world finally validates you, but when you stop waiting for that validation to begin. Stay until the end, because it is entirely possible that what you have been searching for outside all this time has been waiting quietly within you, asking not to be approved of, but simply to be heard. There is a very familiar stage in human life, yet few people recognize how quietly destructive it can become. It is the moment when your sense of worth begins to rise and fall according to the eyes of other people. A compliment can lift your entire mood for the day. A message left unanswered can disturb you more than you want to admit. A single look of indifference, a cold tone, or the absence of approval can make you question not just one action, but yourself. Outwardly, life may still appear orderly. You continue working, speaking, fulfilling responsibilities, doing what is expected. But inwardly, something subtle begins to slip away. Your center is no longer inside you. It has been relocated into the reactions of the world. Carl Jung believed that this is one of the most important psychological losses a person can experience. The moment self-worth becomes dependent on external approval, the deepest anchor of inner life begins to weaken. Not because other people are always wrong, and not because being affected by others is unnatural, but because the authority to define who you are has been handed over to something unstable, shifting, and ultimately outside your control. Once that happens, life is no longer guided primarily by inner truth. You stop asking, is this meaningful to me? You stop asking, does this feel aligned with who I am? And begin asking, how will this look? This is the beginning of what Jung would call alienation. Not alienation in the social or political sense, but psychological alienation. Living at an increasing distance from your own center while still appearing appropriate, capable, and even successful. In Jungian terms, a person can look well-adjusted from the outside while inwardly becoming more and more disconnected from what is real within them. Jung did not see the desire for recognition as a moral failure. He did not condemn it. In fact, he understood it as a natural stage of development. When a person has not yet formed a stable inner core, they rely on the world as a mirror to know who they are. This is not weakness. It is immaturity in the most human sense of the word, not childishness, but incompleteness. Without an inner axis, the external world becomes the only available compass. This is what we might call living by the collective map. Imagine someone trying to cross an unfamiliar landscape without any internal sense of direction. They look around constantly to see where the crowd is moving. If others turn left, they turn left. If everyone stops, they stop. Not because that path is true for them, but because they do not yet know how to orient from within. And this is where the deeper exhaustion begins. I once knew a man in his 30s who was admired by nearly everyone around him. He worked relentlessly, was dependable, high-functioning, and constantly praised for being disciplined and accomplished. But in the rare moments when no one needed him, no one noticed him, and no role demanded anything from him, he felt strangely empty. He could not rest. He did not know what to do with stillness. He had built his life around being useful, productive, and recognized. And without those reflections, he no longer knew how to feel real. This is the hidden cost of living through the external gaze. Jung believed that each individual has a unique rhythm of development, a pace, direction, and process that belongs to them alone. But when you live by approval, comparison, and social timing, you force yourself into rhythms that were never yours. You begin measuring your growth against standards that may have nothing to do with your actual path. The result is inner conflict. Fatigue, confusion, the sense that your life looks correct but does not feel like your own. And this is why focusing only on yourself, in the Jungian sense, is not selfishness. A return to the neglected inner anchor. A return to the question you may have stopped asking long ago: what is true for me, even if no one else confirms it? And at a certain point, if you have lived too long through the eyes of others, a quiet but unsettling question begins to arise. Who, exactly, has been living in my place all this time? According to Carl Jung, the answer is often not another person, but a psychological structure so familiar that most people rarely notice it at all. The persona. Jung used this word to describe the social mask we create in order to adapt to the world, to function, to belong, to be accepted, and to avoid rejection. It begins forming very early. As children, we learn what earns approval, what causes discomfort, what gets us included, and what makes others withdraw. Slowly, almost without realizing it, we build a version of ourselves that can move more safely through the social world. In that sense, the persona is not evil. It is not a flaw. Originally, it serves a protective role. It helps us survive socially. It allows us to enter groups, fulfill responsibilities, and participate in collective life without constantly exposing the most vulnerable parts of ourselves. The problem begins later, when we stop using it as a tool and begin mistaking it for who we truly are. Jung was very clear about this. The persona is useful, but it is not the essence of the person. It is a function, not a soul, a role, not a center. And once someone begins living entirely from that role, life slowly shifts from inner truth to image maintenance. You stop asking what is real. You start asking what is acceptable. You stop asking what feels alive in you. You start asking what version of you will create the least resistance. This is how fear of judgment quietly turns the persona from protection into prison. At first, the adjustments seem harmless. You become more tactful, more appropriate, more controlled. You shape yourself so you will not disappoint, so you will not stand out in the wrong way, so you will not be misunderstood. But over time, the adaptation becomes so constant that it no longer feels like something you do. It begins to feel like who you are. Jung once wrote, "The persona is that which in reality one is not, but which oneself as well as others think one is." That line cuts deeply because so many people live inside that confusion for years. And once that happens, recognition becomes addictive. Praise is no longer pleasant, it becomes necessary. Approval is no longer appreciated, it becomes regulating. Without positive reflection, you begin to feel unsteady, uncertain, almost unreal. I once spoke with a woman working in a highly creative field who was admired by everyone around her. She knew how to present herself well. She was thoughtful, polished, agreeable, and always seemed like the perfect fit for every room she entered. But in private, she admitted something painful. She no longer knew what she genuinely liked. Every desire she had was immediately filtered through an internal question. Will this seem strange? Will this disappoint people? Will this still fit the image they have of me? She had not failed at life, and this is where focus only on yourself takes on a deeper meaning. It does not mean becoming careless, rebellious, or antisocial. It means slowly loosening the mask. It means tolerating moments where you are not recognized, not perfectly understood, not immediately approved of. But Jung would say that this anxiety is not proof that you are losing your way. It may be proof that you are finally getting closer to what is true. And once the persona begins to loosen, once you are no longer living entirely to be accepted, another reflex usually appears almost immediately. You begin looking sideways. You may no longer be asking, do they approve of me? But now you ask, where am I compared to them? Who seems more stable? Who has already arrived? Who appears more certain, more accomplished, more complete? And without noticing it, you enter a different trap. Comparison. According to Carl Jung, this is not a small habit of insecurity. It is something much deeper. It is the quiet denial of your own individual path. Jung believed that no two processes of psychological development are the same. No two people unfold according to the same rhythm, the same timing, the same sequence of struggle and growth. Each person carries a unique pattern within them, a different structure of wounds, potentials, conflicts, and possibilities. And because of that, each life has its own tempo. But society does not honor that. Society imposes shared timelines. By a certain age, you should know what you are doing. By a certain age, you should be successful. By a certain age, you should be settled, stable, accomplished, recognized. And when you begin measuring yourself against those milestones, something subtle happens. You stop listening to your own maturation process and begin forcing yourself into a rhythm that may have nothing to do with your actual development. This is why comparison is not merely insecurity, it is a betrayal of individuation. For Jung, individuation meant becoming who you truly are, not a more polished version of someone else, not a socially successful imitation, but the gradual unfolding of your own deepest pattern. And every time you look at another life and conclude, I am behind, I am failing, or I should already be further, you deny the legitimacy of your own process simply because it does not resemble theirs. At first, they know where they are meant to go. Their destination is their own. But the moment they start listening too closely to the footsteps around them, they speed up, change pace, even shift direction, not because it is right for them, but because they cannot bear the feeling of falling behind. Eventually, they become exhausted, not because the path was too hard, but because they were trying to keep pace instead of follow direction. That is what comparison does. It makes speed feel more important than truth. I once knew a man who spent years feeling quietly ashamed at every reunion with old friends. They had careers that looked established, families that looked stable, lives that seemed coherent from the outside. He, on the other hand, had changed paths several times, questioned everything, and often felt uncertain about where he was going. For years, he believed this meant he had fallen behind. But eventually, during a period of deep inner crisis, he realized something that changed him. He was not lost. He was simply on a different path, slower by collective standards perhaps, but deeper by his own. And when he accepted that, the heaviness began to lift. Not because he caught up, but because he returned to his own rhythm. Jung once wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." That line becomes impossible to live if you are constantly measuring yourself against people whose path was never yours to begin with. Even myth reflects this truth. Achilles is powerful only when he follows his own destiny. The moment he becomes seduced by collective glory, by the image of greatness rather than the truth of his path, he steps into vulnerability. In Jungian terms, this is what happens when a person abandons their own unfolding in order to chase a timeline imposed by the world. So focusing only on yourself here does not mean narcissism or withdrawal. And the moment you step out of comparison, something remarkable happens. Your actual path begins to appear, not louder, but clearer. And even after you step away from comparison, even after you begin loosening the persona and questioning the timelines imposed by the world, one thing often remains. The fear of being judged. You may no longer be openly competing. You may no longer be obsessed with keeping up. Why? It is a sign that you have reached a deeper layer of the inner journey, because the fear of judgment does not always come from other people. This is where Jung introduced one of his most important ideas, projection. Projection is the act of unconsciously placing inner material onto the outer world. When there is something in yourself you do not fully accept, a fear, a belief, a wound, a hidden judgment, the psyche often attributes it to others. You begin to feel that other people are seeing you a certain way, when in reality you are encountering your own unacknowledged material reflected through them. In that sense, the question is not always, are they judging me? The deeper question is, what in me am I unable to accept? Jung once wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves." The same is true of the things we fear in others. If you constantly feel watched, doubted, dismissed, or quietly condemned, it may be because a part of you is already carrying those judgments from within. The outer world then becomes the screen onto which that inner voice is projected. I once knew a woman who was convinced that her colleagues did not respect her. Every question felt to her like doubt. Every suggestion felt like criticism. Every neutral expression seemed to carry hidden disapproval. She lived in a constant state of subtle tension, as if she were always being evaluated. But when she began looking more honestly within herself, she discovered something difficult but clarifying. Beneath all of it was a belief she had never consciously admitted. I am not good enough. She had not heard others say it. She was saying it to herself. And because she could not yet face it directly, she kept encountering it in the imagined opinions of those around her. Once she began working with that inner belief, once she started recognizing and slowly integrating her own self-doubt, something changed. The outside world felt less hostile, less loaded, less personal. Not because everyone around her suddenly became kinder, but because the projection was beginning to withdraw. Modern cognitive psychology describes something similar. The mind does not interpret situations neutrally. It filters ambiguous information through pre-existing beliefs. If you already carry a deep expectation of criticism, your brain becomes highly sensitive to uncertainty. A look, a tone, a delay, a silence, all of it gets interpreted through the same inner lens. Jung understood this long before contemporary research gave it different language. What we fear in the world often has roots in what we have not yet acknowledged in ourselves, and this is why integrating the shadow matters so deeply. The shadow, in Jungian terms, is not evil. It is simply the part of yourself you have denied, repressed, or disowned. When you begin to recognize it, listen to it, and bring it into conscious awareness, something subtle but profound happens. The world stops feeling so full of judgment. You do not become indifferent, you become less divided, because focus only on yourself, at this stage, no longer means withdrawing from other people. It means reclaiming the psychological energy you have projected outward. It means turning back to the inner voice before assuming it belongs to the world. And eventually, the question itself begins to change. You stop asking, who is judging me, and begin asking something much truer. What in me wants to be seen? And once projection begins to weaken, once you stop imagining that every silence, every expression, every reaction around you is secretly about you, something else begins to happen. Life grows quieter. And in that quiet, something many people have spent years avoiding begins to appear: solitude. For most people, solitude is immediately misunderstood. It is associated with absence, abandonment, social failure, emptiness. But Carl Jung saw it very differently. For him, solitude was not a deficiency. It was sacred space. Not the absence of life, but the condition in which deeper life finally becomes audible. Jung once wrote, "Loneliness does not come from having no people around you, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to you." That line reveals something essential. The deepest loneliness is not always about being physically alone. It is about being cut off from what is most real within you. And when you have lived too long in response to the outer world, you often lose contact with that inner reality entirely. The opinions, moods, expectations, and rhythms of others become so loud that the self has no room left to speak. This is why solitude is necessary, not as punishment, not as retreat for its own sake, but as the condition in which the noise settles enough for the self to begin coming forward again. Imagine a lake in the early morning. When the surface is disturbed by wind, all you see are broken reflections, movement, distortion, fragmentation. But when the wind calms, the lake becomes still, and suddenly something deeper appears. The water no longer only reflects the world above it. It begins to reveal its own depth. As long as you are surrounded by constant stimulation, reaction, distraction, and emotional noise, you remain on the surface of yourself. But in solitude, when no one is immediately asking something of you, when there is no one to impress, please, reassure, or resist, deeper layers begin to emerge. And this is precisely what many people fear. They fear what silence might reveal. Because when the noise falls away, the buried things begin to surface. Unnamed desires, old sadness, conflicted longings, questions you have postponed for years. Jung believed this was not a problem to avoid, but a threshold to cross. If you never allow these things to come into awareness, they continue shaping your life from beneath the surface. A powerful example of this appears in the life of Oprah Winfrey. Early in her career, she was removed from her role as a television news co-anchor because she was seen as not fitting the detached style the position required. Outwardly, it looked like rejection and misfit, but inwardly, it became a turning point. She moved away from a role that demanded distance and entered a form of expression far more aligned with her nature, one rooted in emotional truth, presence, and human connection. What looked like professional failure became the opening through which her real voice emerged. In Jungian terms, this was not simply a setback, but a movement away from false adaptation and toward a more authentic center. A different but equally revealing example appears in the early life of Michael Jordan. When he was cut from his high school varsity basketball team, the moment outwardly looked like exclusion, disappointment, and defeat. But inwardly, it became a period of concentration, discipline, and deeper resolve. Rather than allowing that rejection to define him, he turned inward, trained relentlessly, and built an identity rooted not in immediate recognition, but in inner commitment. When he returned, he did not come back merely improved, but transformed. In Jungian terms, the rejection was not the end of his path. It was the pressure that forced his character to root itself more deeply than praise ever could. That is what solitude can become, but return. So when we say, focus only on yourself, what we mean here is not abandoning people. It means creating enough distance from social noise to restore inner order, enough silence for the self to speak, enough stillness for something true to surface. And once that happens, something surprising follows. You do not become less capable of relationship, you become more authentic within it. Because solitude, when entered consciously, does not separate you from others, and after solitude has done its work, after the noise has quieted enough for you to hear something real within yourself, another transition begins. It is no longer only about stepping back from the world. It becomes about learning how to live from a different center. At first, these two forms of discipline can look similar from the outside. In both cases, a person may work hard, remain consistent, and appear committed. But inwardly, they are very different. One kind of discipline is driven by the extroverted ego. It is fueled by the desire to be seen, admired, validated, or proven worthy through achievement. The other kind of discipline arises from something quieter and far more stable. It comes from inner necessity, from the sense that something within you must be honored, developed, or brought into form whether anyone notices or not. Jung understood this distinction deeply. The extroverted ego acts in order to secure its image in the world. It seeks reflection, confirmation, and visible results. But the inner-centered self acts for a different reason. It acts because something essential is asking to be realized. Not displayed, not performed, realized. That is why Jung never believed there was one formula for a good life. He wrote, "The shoe that fits one person pinches another. There is no recipe for living that suits all cases. What strengthens one person may deform another. What looks like success from the outside may be deeply misaligned from within. So real discipline cannot begin with imitation. It has to begin with listening." A useful way to understand this is through the image of a tree. Most people are trained to care about the visible parts, the branches, the shape, the height, the way the tree appears when others look at it. But the life of the tree depends on something hidden, its roots. No one applauds the roots, no one sees them deepen. Yet they determine whether the tree will remain standing when conditions become difficult. Inner discipline works the same way. It is not mainly about making your life look more impressive. It is about strengthening what is unseen. I once knew a man working in finance who had spent years living by deadlines, expectations, and external results. His life was efficient, but inwardly he was scattered and exhausted. After a period of burnout, he did not make some dramatic public change. He did something much quieter. He began waking slightly earlier each day. He wrote a few honest lines in a notebook before checking his phone. He chose one task each day that genuinely mattered and completed it without noise, without performance, without needing anyone to know. No one praised these changes. No one even noticed them. But over time, he became steadier, less reactive, clearer in his decisions. His life did not become louder. It became more rooted. Modern research on intrinsic motivation points in a similar direction. When people act mainly for rewards, status, or external evaluation, their energy becomes unstable and easily depleted. But when action is tied to personal meaning, coherence, and inward commitment, motivation becomes more sustainable. Jung understood this psychologically long before it was described scientifically. Energy lasts when it serves something real within the person. It is silent consistency. It is keeping small promises to yourself. It is returning day after day to what you know matters, even when no one is watching. And over time, this quiet integrity builds something powerful. An inner center, a kind of invisible strength. And this is the paradox Jung helps us see. The more deeply you focus on yourself, the more steadily you are able to show up in life. But what happens when you have already begun building a disciplined inner life? And still, somewhere inside, you find yourself waiting. Waiting for the world to confirm you. Waiting for recognition to reassure you that you are on the right path. Waiting for some visible response that tells you your effort, your work, or your becoming is real. Because validation, even in very subtle forms, can remain as one of the last hidden dependencies. You may no longer live entirely by comparison. You may no longer need constant praise. You may even appear independent from the outside. And yet inwardly a quiet movement remains, the wish to be seen, to be affirmed, to be reflected back by the world as worthy. Jung would say, this is not failure. It is simply a sign that the ego is still maturing. In its earlier stages, the ego needs reflection from outside in order to feel real. It needs approval, acknowledgement, and feedback, because it has not yet formed enough inner unity to stand on its own. That is not weakness. It is part of development. But the ego is not meant to remain there forever. As it matures, it gradually becomes less dependent on external mirrors and more rooted in a deeper coherence within. This is where many people misunderstand what it means to focus on yourself. They imagine it means egoism, self-absorption, or cold withdrawal from others. But in the Jungian sense, it means something very different. It means withdrawing psychic energy from external approval. It means stopping the habit of sending your sense of worth outward and waiting for it to be returned through praise, attention, or reassurance. I once knew a woman who had made real inner progress. She no longer compared herself constantly. She had built a quieter life, was more honest with herself, and worked with more integrity than before. But one subtle pattern remained. Whenever she shared a personal project, something meaningful to her, she immediately checked for response, not obsessively, but just enough to reveal that part of her still wanted the world to confirm the value of what she had created. The turning point came when she noticed that movement in herself and stopped feeding it. She did not become indifferent. She simply returned to the inner feeling of the work itself, the meaning of having done it, the truth of having expressed something real. And in doing that, she felt a shift. The work no longer rose or fell with other people's reactions. It remained grounded in its own necessity. Jung once wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely, because complete self-acceptance means you no longer need others to constantly witness your worth in order to believe in it yourself. For the immature ego, that feels like loss. But for the maturing self, it becomes liberation. Imagine your psychic energy like water. When you seek validation, that water keeps flowing outward, scattered across surfaces, waiting to be reflected back. But when you withdraw that energy, it begins moving downward into the roots. No one sees it there. It makes no spectacle. But it nourishes what is essential. That is emotional independence, not becoming numb, but no longer being inwardly destabilized by praise or criticism. And when that begins to happen, focus only on yourself stops feeling like effort. It becomes natural, quiet, almost effortless, because at that stage you are no longer living to be seen. You are living to remain in inner truth. And that is a rare kind of freedom. And when you reach this point, something begins to become clear. What at first looked like withdrawal was never really withdrawal. It was return. A return from the scattered life of reaction to a more rooted way of being. A return from living through other people's eyes to living from an inner center. A return from the endless effort to be approved of, understood, admired, or kept in the right place by the world. It was never about becoming cold, self-enclosed, or indifferent. And it was never about proving that you do not need anyone. It is something much quieter than all of that. It is the gradual movement of the center of gravity in your life from outside to inside. At first, you may not even notice it happening. You simply begin to feel less compelled to explain yourself, less eager to defend your pace, less frightened by misunderstanding. You stop asking the world so often whether your life is acceptable and begin asking something else entirely. Is it true? Does it belong to me? These are different questions. A life that may not look more impressive from the outside, but feels more coherent from within. Because life does not necessarily become easier when you return to yourself. You may still face uncertainty. You may still be misunderstood. You may still move through seasons that look unimpressive by collective standards. But the difference is that you are no longer organized around those standards. You are no longer living quickly just to keep pace, correctly just to be accepted, or visibly just to feel real. You begin living according to something deeper, a rhythm, a necessity, a truth that cannot always be explained but can be recognized inwardly. And paradoxically, it is often only when you stop trying to secure your place in the world that the world begins to lose its power to shake you. That is a very different kind of strength. Not dramatic, not loud, but steady. And from that steadiness, something else becomes possible. You can finally relate to other people without disappearing into them. You can work without turning your labor into self-proof. You can receive praise without becoming inflated, and criticism without collapsing. You can be present in life without constantly turning yourself into an object to be evaluated. This is what psychological freedom begins to feel like. Not separation from the world, but no longer being ruled by it inwardly. So if something in this journey has felt familiar to you, if even a part of it has named something you have sensed for a long time without being able to articulate, then perhaps you are already closer to yourself than you think. Perhaps the fatigue you have been feeling is not emptiness. Perhaps what is ending is not your direction, but your dependence on what was never meant to define you. And perhaps what is beginning, quietly, almost invisibly, is the life that can only emerge once you stop asking to be seen. If this video touched something real in you, share it with someone who may also be tired of living under the weight of other people's eyes. And if you want to continue this journey inward, subscribe to the channel and keep walking with us. And if you'd like to go a step further in supporting this work, you can now leave a super thanks below. It's a small way to say thank you, and it truly helps keep this channel going. Not to become a better image for the world, but to stop losing yourself within it.